Hello everybody. I've been requested to talk about the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, which is indeed the pillars of the Buddha's teachings. In fact, soon after his perfect awakening, the Buddha gave his first sermon to the group of 5 ascetics, and he basically talked about the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. He started off by talking about the Noble Eightfold Path as the middle path. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the usage of the word the middle path, which is sometimes used quite sweepingly, I would say. It's become a cliche. But when we want to understand the middle path, the middle way that the Buddha was referring to, we must understand it in accordance with the context. Well, the context is this. Before the Buddha's renunciation, he was enjoying a life of luxury. He himself said that his wealthy father pampered him by giving him 3 mansions for the 3 different seasons, which were all staffed by women, and he was indeed enjoying the pleasures of the senses. Before his spiritual maturity ripened, and he began to look for a deeper meaning in life. And so soon after he left his home, he went in search of spiritual teachers. At that time there was Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta. To cut a long story short, he became their students. Alara Kalama attained to the 3rd stage of the formless attainments, because that was as far as Alara Kalama could attain himself. And after that, he was not satisfied with that attainment, and he thought that there must be something higher, and this was not what he was seeking for. So he went looking for another teacher, and soon he came across Uddaka Ramaputta. Seems that Uddaka was either the son or a chief disciple of the ascetic called Rama. Rama had already passed away, and this Uddaka was actually taking over his teacher's post. So they called him Uddaka Rama's son. So Rama taught until the 4th formless attainment, but he himself had not attained it. He just knew how to get there through his teacher's instructions. So he gave his instructions to Gautama at that time, and Siddhartha Gautama, being a very gifted meditator, very soon attained to the stage that Uddaka Ramaputta's teacher had himself attained. But Uddaka had not attained it. So he was also a very spiritually matured person, very humble, and he offered to let Gautama, who had now attained the same attainment that his teacher had, to take over all his students. Nowadays, if something like that was to happen, the teacher would feel envious and would try to do all sorts of things to disrepute his student who had become better than him, or do other things to get rid of him. But he was a very matured person, and he genuinely pleaded that Gautama should take over his position as teacher of all his students. However, at that time, Gautama also was not satisfied with that attainment, and he went to seek further by himself. He left Uddaka Ramaputta, and then he went on to practice self-mortification. At that time, among the shamanas, among the renunciants, the recluses, there is a popular belief that if we mortify ourselves and keep the body so busy with having to cope with discomfort and pain, then one would be repaying the debts of our old karma. our past bad karma by undergoing all this self-mortification. At the same time, because we are so busy with coping with this hardship, discomfort and pain, we would not have the time to indulge in sensual pleasures and therefore create new karma. So that was a belief at that time. And so he experimented with that, going on a very austere practice, many of which are mentioned in some of the suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya, Sihanara Sutta, for example. And so it is said in the commentaries that he did that for about 6 years. And some of his practices were sleeping on nails, going around naked, staying in very extreme temperatures, like staying in the hot sun without any shade, and during the winter months to stay in the open throughout the night, and also to eat very, very little food. And finally he just ate about just a handful of beans. But he was so emaciated that he fainted and almost died. But after that he regained consciousness, and he thought that this must surely not be the path that can lead to the goal that I'm looking for, which is the ending of all sufferings. Okay, so to cut a long story short, he abandoned that and took some time to regain his strength. And then he practiced to attain the jhanas and also to attain the psychic power of being able to see past lives and understand the karmic consequences of actions, how beings, himself as well as others, were reborn according to the karma that they had created. So finally, after seeing all that, he attained supreme enlightenment by penetrating the Four Noble Truths. So, to understand it in this context, the middle way or the middle path means what is not the extreme of sensual indulgence, which he was indulging in before he renounced as the son of a wealthy man, and also not to undertake self-mortification and cause harm and suffering to oneself for no beneficial results. Okay, so that was what he meant. Now, when we talk about indulgence in sensual desires, one could think that it is doing something which is beyond the ordinary. For example, you might not think that enjoying a delicious plate of char kway teow is sensual indulgence, nor would you think that enjoying a cup of coffee is sensual indulgence from the conventional point of view. But if you're talking about the middle path that leads to the end of suffering, that is also indulgence. As long as you are involved in enjoying the pleasures of the senses, then you are not on the noble evil path, as we shall see later. Because the second path factor, which is right thought, involves renunciation. Renunciation from sensual pleasures. But anyway, we will come to that later. So let me get back to the first sermon that the Buddha talked about, that was given to the 5 ascetics, those 5 who actually attended to him when he was doing his self-mortification, but abandoned him when they saw that he was going back to eating and regaining his health and strength before embarking on the path of practicing for the jhanas. So they thought that he had abandoned his practice, and so they left him. They abandoned him because they thought that he had abandoned the practice of self-mortification, which they thought would lead to liberation and enlightenment. But then after the Buddha got enlightened, he thought about them, and he thought that they were the people who were most suited to receive his teachings and benefit from them at that time. So he He went looking for them, he found them, and then he started off by saying, there are two things that a renunciant should not be involved in. The first is indulgence in the pleasures of the senses, and the second is self-mortification. And he said that he had found the middle way, which is neither indulgence in sense pleasures, nor is it self-mortification. And he says, so what is this middle path, this middle way? It is none other than the noble eightfold path, which is right view, right thoughts, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right composure or samadhi. So these are the 8 factors. And after having listed that 8 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, he went on to talk about the 4 Noble Truths, instead of elaborating on them. So he talked about the first Noble Truth, which is suffering. And he defined suffering in a conventional and ultimate sense. He defined suffering in 5 ways: birth, aging, sickness, and death. It's very ironic because nowadays you celebrate a birthday, you say happy birthday. But from the Buddhist point of view, birth is actually suffering. In fact, the commentaries describe birth, of course, is an exaggeration. It says it's like pushing an elephant through a keyhole. Depending, see how much suffering you are undergoing by having to come out of your mother's womb, being pushed out of her womb. So that is a lot of suffering for the child as well as the mother. So birthing in itself is suffering. So is aging. When you age, you can't see clearly, you can't hear clearly, your teeth start to fall off, and your hair turn gray and so forth, and then you feel that you are getting old and wrinkled and unhappy. You are no longer at the prime of your youth. So that is another form of suffering. Sickness, of course, is suffering. There is no doubt about it. And death, perhaps death is kind of ambiguous. For most people, it's suffering because they are clinging to life on this earth. Well, for some others who don't cling so much, who want to commit suicide because of so much suffering, so much depression that they can't stand any longer, well, death may not be suffering. It's happiness to them, or that's what they think. But in any case, death is suffering, especially if you die a very painful death. The second is association with the unloved. The third is dissociation from the loved. The fourth is not getting what is desired. And the fifth, in brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging is suffering. I said earlier that the Buddha defines suffering in conventionally as well as in the ultimate sense. 1 to 4 are all conventional. And number 5 is in the ultimate sense. Now, it doesn't have to take a Sammasambuddha, a perfectly self-awakened one, to tell us about the first 4 types of suffering. It's very obvious. Correct. Even a child would know. If a child does not get what he or she wants, then it will start crying, and that's suffering. And when you use the word suffering, most people tend to think that suffering means painful suffering. But if you look below, there are actually 3 types of suffering. One is called dukkha dukkha, painful suffering. The second is called viparinama dukkha, transformational suffering. And the last one is called sankhara dukkha, or constructional suffering. Let me explain. Dukkha dukkha is the suffering that most people understand. That is when you stumble across tree stump right? Or you step on a thorn when you are barefooted, or you accidentally knock into the door, and so forth. All this painful suffering. That is painful suffering, which is very obvious. Everybody knows that. It doesn't need a Sama Sambuddha to tell you that. The second is viparinama dukkha, or transformational suffering. This is actually another word for pleasant experiences. When you enjoy something, you enjoy a good relationship. Maybe when you start to fall in love with somebody, it's such a great relationship to have that somebody who makes you so happy whenever you are with him or her. And then because of that, there is the clinging to that relationship. It's something pleasant and you like it. It gives you, a lot of adrenaline and serotonin and all that sort of stuff. So it gives you a high. You feel you like it. So that is actually transformational suffering, because eventually when the relationship breaks up, then there's a lot of suffering, especially when you think of all the good old times that you had together. Your relationship was so perfect, you were so happy, and now it's no longer there. And that hankering after that past pleasant experiences is painful suffering. So that pleasant experience at that time is actually potential dukkha. It will become transformational dukkha eventually, if there is craving involved when you are enjoying pleasant experiences. Then the next one is called sankhara dukkha. I call constructional suffering, suffering that is related to constructions. Constructions is a translation of the word sankhara. Sometimes it is translated as fabrications by Ajahn Thanissaro. It is translated as mental formations. Sometimes it's translated as conditioned phenomena. In short, what it actually means is anything that is constructed out of causes and conditions. That is a construction. Alright? So this is the ultimate suffering. Even though you are having pleasant experiences at a particular time, and that pleasant experience, although it has the potential of suffering embedded in it, if there is attachment or craving to that experience, even though that suffering has not occurred yet, because that pleasant experience is still happening, even at that time, it is constructional suffering, because nothing lasts forever. Everything arises and passes away from moment to moment, although we don't really see it, we don't really experience it that way. It is an illusion that we live with all the time. Many, many years ago, I think back in 1984 or 85, I accompanied Sayadaw Pandita, Sayadaw Pandita, to the US, to Barre, Massachusetts, to the Insight Meditation Society. And there was Sayadaw Pandita's maiden retreat in the West. And he taught all the big timers, Ram Dass, Joseph Goldstein, Jack Cornfield, Sharon Salzberg, all those big timers were there. He was the teacher's retreat, and he was teaching them. And I was there as a translator. A professor from Harvard conducted an experiment on those yogis who had gone through that 3-month intensive retreat. The experiment started before the retreat started, because they had to know what was their mental state, their mental agility and capability before and after the retreat. So they used an instrument called a T-scope. A T-scope is a screen, it's like a monitor, and that device is able to produce sparks that will appear on the screen. And the frequency of these sparks, one spark from another, can be manipulated, can be adjusted by the operator. So what they will do is they will ask each of their respondents, of their subjects, to look at the screen, and then they will calibrate their ability to differentiate one spark from another. So they will slowly increase the frequency from one spark to another, and then when the gap of the sparks becomes smaller and smaller until the subject is unable to distinguish two sparks and can only see one, that is the threshold level of the particular yogi, and that will differ from yogi to yogi. All right, so they have subjected all of them to the test that was before the retreat, and they have their threshold level for each of them. Then after the end of the retreat, all these yogis will have to go for another test. And it was just amazing because their threshold level increased by 500%. Some of them. What does it mean? It means that initially, before they started their retreat, they could only see two sparks as one spark because they could not see the interval in between them. But at the end of the 3-month intensive retreat, some of them could see one spark, and then there's a gap in between before the other spark arises. So you can see how fantastic it is. It is because the mind has been trained to be mindful and attentive to phenomena in a microscopic way, that it can see that everything is arising and passing away from moment to moment, which prior to that training we think is not so. What we thought was one spark was actually two sparks with a space in between. Another common phenomena is the fluorescent lamp. The fluorescent lamp is actually on AC current, and it is fluctuating from no light to light at the speed of about 60 times per second. But we think that the fluorescent lamp is on all the time. We don't really see the flickering. Yeah? So that is also another illusion. Ultimately, the 5 aggregates of form, feeling, perception, volitional activities, and consciousness are arising from moment to moment in a discrete way. They are not one continuous mind. You have many, many minds that are arising and passing from moment to moment. In English, when we use the word mind, each one of us has only got one mind, correct? But in Pali, the word chitta can be plural or singular, because the mind changes all the time, from moment to moment, according to causes and conditions. So that is the ultimate suffering, because there's no way that you can control this arising and passing away from moment to moment of the 5 aggregates. All the Buddhas, all the Arahants are in the same boat as all other sentient beings in respect to this sankhara dukkha, this constructional suffering. As long as you have the 5 aggregates, you are subject to this. As long as you are conscious, the mind will be bombarded by all sorts of stimuli through the 5 senses. Although the Arahants and the Buddhas are able to control their thinking, they can think what they want and they can stop what they don't want to think. Or they have control over their minds, but the mind still keeps on responding to whatever stimuli that is coming to the senses, non-stop. For ordinary people, when you're sleeping, you think the mind is having a rest. It's not having a rest. It's still having dreams and all sorts of things going on which you are not conscious of. Okay, so now let's try to see how we can categorize these 5 types of suffering that the Buddha listed or defined in his first sermon, in terms of these 3 that we talked about: painful suffering, transformational suffering, constructional suffering. All these three present in the definition of suffering that the Buddha gave. What do you think? Look at the first one. Birth, aging, sickness, death. Which of the three types of suffering do they belong to? So if you look at the color, you will know. Birth, aging and sickness come under dukkha dukkha, painful suffering. Death, as I mentioned earlier, it could be painful for most people. It may not appear to be painful for some people. Right? So it is sort of ambiguous. And then association with the unloved, of course, that is suffering. That is the dukkha dukkha, painful suffering. And dissociation from the loved is, of course, viparinama dukkha, transformational suffering. Yeah, I talked about the love affair that you had when you first met somebody, and then later your relationship broke off, and then you hanker after all those good times that you had, and that's where the suffering comes. I was watching one YouTube video some time ago. This guy who is, you could say he's a semi-psychic, he would ask somebody from the audience to come up. Actually, he asked one young lady to come up to the stage, and he asked the young lady to hold a champagne glass. And then this guy said, yeah, I know that you had an affair with somebody and you broke up. Now, I want you to think of that person that you broke up with. Hold that in your hand and think of that person. And what happened? When she thought about that person as she was holding the champagne glass, it shattered into pieces. You see how much energy there is in hate, because she had not forgiven him. She is still holding that grudge in herself with so much hate. So that is the energy of hate. That is the suffering. Dissociation from the loved. Once she loved so dearly, but now she hates just as dearly, like a pendulum swinging from one end to the other end. You hate as much as you love, or even greater. Then the fourth one, not getting what is desired. Yeah, not getting what is desired, of course, is suffering. That's painful suffering. But what is desired could be something that is pleasurable at the moment, when you have an idea and you want to fulfill that idea, fulfill the desire, you're full of excitement and you feel kind of thrilled, sense of pleasure to get what you want. That sets your adrenaline going. That gives you the pleasure hormones. So that could also be transformational suffering, because it was such a kick in the beginning, but then because finally you couldn't get what you wanted, then it became painful suffering. So it is transformational suffering too. And finally, the five aggregates subject to cleaning, that is from the ultimate sense, which is constructional suffering. As I said just now, even the arahants are not free from that. Of these three types of suffering mentioned at the bottom, how many can arahants and Buddhas be freed from? They can only be freed from the second type, transformational suffering. But they can't be freed from the first and the third. They can't be freed from painful suffering because they still have this body, and the body is subject to all sorts of discomfort due to the weather, due to food, and so forth. And of course, sankhara dukkha. They cannot help but experience the suffering of this incessant arising and passing of all the five aggregates. But they can be freed from transformational suffering, because an arahant may enjoy good food, may enjoy the aircon in his room, but he does so without attachment, without any craving. And because of that, even if those things are no longer there, he will not hanker after them. So there's no more transformational suffering for the arahant. So this is suffering, and the Four Noble Truths stay that there is suffering, there is a cause of suffering, and there can be a cessation of suffering, and there is a way that leads to the cessation of suffering. So suffering is defined as I explained just now. So what is the cause of suffering? The cause of suffering is craving. The craving that leads to further rebirth. The craving that delights in things here and there. Even if a person is in very dire circumstances, that person still craves for existence, craves for living. Unless, of course, that person is so depressed or has suicidal tendencies due to other causes. Otherwise, a person would try to survive under all circumstances, even how difficult the conditions may be. So that is the craving of wanting to remain alive. And some people can very easily say, it's so easy, I can just enjoy without desire, enjoy without attachment. I don't want to live again, I don't want to come back to this life. You think it's so simple? When you get to your deathbed at that time, you will see how you will cling. The dying man clings to a straw. You will cling to the straw even when you are about to die. You can see all those people who are in coma, hanging on for months and years and still not willing to go. Some of them is because of clinging. It seems from nurses and caregivers, they say that when the person whom they are attached to is willing to give up, is willing to let go, and gives permission to that person to move on, then that person can move on quite quickly. Because that attachment is two ways. It could be attachment from the living side, or it could be attachment from the comatose patient, whichever. Because they have created a bond between themselves. And so any craving or attachment from any side will still bind the other to the life that he or she is in. Whether it's a comatose or in the in-between stage. For example, people who die suddenly in an accident or having a terminal disease, you get COVID today and you die 2 days later. These are the people who tend to hang around in the in-between state because their karma have not really dissipated yet. That their karmic energy is still there. And so if the other party is still having a lot of attachment, then that will keep that person in the limbo for as long as the attachment is there between the two of them. So the sooner the attachment is cut, the better. The third noble truth is the ending of suffering. There can be a cessation of suffering, and that cessation of suffering is achieved by the complete cutting off or abandoning of craving. I think that some of you meditators who have been meditating for some time may perhaps know that you have certain attachments and desires to certain things or expectations. And you have been watching your mind for a long time. You know that a lot of suffering that you are causing yourselves or causing others is due to your attachment to certain ideas, certain expectations, certain beliefs, because you're holding on to these. And that's why you react when people don't live up to your expectations, your beliefs, to whatever. And that causes a lot of suffering for yourself and for others. And yet you do it again and again and again. And you still suffer. Although you know it intellectually, you know that it's because of this craving, of this attachment to these beliefs, expectations, and so forth, that you are suffering. And you know that there's a cause of suffering, and yet you cannot give it up. It is still there. Why is that so? Because there's only intellectual understanding. That's not insight. That's not true wisdom. Well, some people need to do it the hard way. If you have managed to practice well enough so that your practice of mindfulness becomes second nature to you in your daily life, and not only when you are on a silent, intensive retreat, that is second or even first nature to you, you are able to see whatever goes on in your mind and even not executing all those thoughts and intentions that are going on in your mind, verbally or physically. You are able to arrest them in time. So if you are someone like this who has succeeded in internalizing mindfulness to his daily life, then you will see again and again. And once when you see enough, when there is enough wisdom, not intellectually but experientially, seeing how the suffering that is caused due to this attachment, then one fine day it will dawn upon you. Ayya, why so stupid? I just let go of this and it's done. And suddenly you just really truly let go because you have seen enough, you have suffered enough. At that point of time, that suffering ceases completely. I'll give you an example. One of my yogis, I was conducting a Hokkien retreat in SBS some years ago. Most of my students were oldies, And there was one middle-aged lady who was there, one of the younger yogis. And one day she was in the meditation hall. She saw this elderly lady walking into the hall. And the moment she saw her, there was a feeling of dislike that arose in her. And she wondered, why do I have this feeling of dislike for this woman? I don't know her. I've never seen her. This is the first time I've seen her. And why should I have any dislike for her? And she asked the question, why? But I have taught them to not pursue your questions intellectually. You just ask the question and then drop it and then go on to practice open mindfulness. And so that's what she did. She just asked the question, dropped it, and then continued her practice. And later on, either the later part of the day or the next day while she was sitting, suddenly it dawned upon her that this woman looked like her grandma. And her grandma was a very traditional Chinese old lady. She preferred a grandson, not a granddaughter. And so she was very disappointed when she was born because she was not the son, not the grandson, but the granddaughter. And the grandmother didn't treat her very well. So because of that, she had this dislike for her grandmother. And because this person looked like her grandmother, so there was this unconscious dislike that arose in her for no apparent reason. So it is buried in the subconscious. But the moment that she realized this, then the next time when she saw that woman again, there was no dislike whatsoever. So that suffering of dislike disappeared because she saw the cause of the dislike was clinging on to the idea that someone who looks like her grandmother would treat her in the same way like what she did. Okay, so that is the cause of suffering. As long as you are able to understand the cause of suffering is attachment, then at that moment when there is deep understanding, that suffering will completely disappear. That is the cessation of suffering. So this applies at various levels. Like what I said just now, the example I gave you is a very conventional level. But this also applies to a very ultimate level in the sense of the abandonment of all sorts of cravings, attachments and desires that will lead to the ending of rebirth. I mean, ending of all forms of suffering, especially the suffering of having the five aggregates. As long as there are the five aggregates, suffering will always be there. And therefore, Nibbana is the cessation of the five aggregates because there's no more five aggregates to suffer. Alright, so there can be a cessation of suffering if you can abandon that craving causing that suffering. Then the fourth noble truth is the way that leads to the cessation of suffering. Yeah, it's easier said than done. How can one abandon attachment, abandon desire? Then one has to follow the Noble Eightfold Path. Then only will one be able to understand the cause of suffering, which is craving, attachment, desire, and then abandon it for the suffering to cease. Okay, so this is the Four Noble Truths in brief. Basically, it's about identifying the cause of your particular suffering that you are having. Talking from a worldly sense, all the mental sufferings, I would say, that people have can be singled down to just a few things. It's just your attachment to expectations of how people should behave, of views and opinions, and of beliefs. Basically, these are the three things that cause suffering in people, in all of us. And if you watch your mind all the time, every time you suffer, ask yourself why, and you can see very, very clearly that it is some sort of suffering. In fact, that was my practice before I renounced. Before I renounced, I didn't really know anything about meditation. I couldn't even sit quietly for 10 minutes. I was fascinated by Zen at that time. And Zen says, when you walk, just walk. When you sit, just sit. But when I sit, I just can't sit, you know. I'll be doing all sorts of things in the mind. But I was very fascinated by the Four Noble Truths. And I wanted to verify these Four Noble Truths in a conventional sense in my daily life, not in a formal sitting meditation situation. So from a very early age, even before I learned any meditation, I was really watching my mind all the time. Whenever I felt disappointed, I felt upset, I felt angry, I felt hurt, I asked myself, why? And invariably, the answer is attachment. Attachment to expectations of how people should behave towards you, expectations of how things should be, right? Attachment to your belief system, to your opinions and views. That's all. Very simple. And so the more I saw of that, you know, the more I got disillusioned with the world. And finally, I renounced the world. Okay, so I hope that this will be encouragement for all of you, even though you may not have the time or the circumstances that are conducive to do long-term intensive retreat. You can still go a long way if you keep on watching your mind all the time and try to understand this first and second noble truths in your daily life as often as you can.